Hey guys, my name is Patrick Blaszczyk, and today we're going to be doing the In Practice 8.1, talking about some watches. So let's get going here. First off, I want to start off with some background history and just the general differences between some of the brands that were listed in the case. Unfortunately, I do want to say that the case wasn't really super specific about the Swiss brands. It did mention Swatch, but the rest you kind of have to assume. And if you're familiar with Swiss watches, there's over 100 brands, right? So it's kind of tough to decide which companies they're actually talking about in the Swiss industry. Anyways, here's some fun facts, I guess, a little bit of background on Rolex, Timex, and Bulova. If you want to read, most of the really important parts are underlined, like the first invention of the waterproof or dustproof watch and the perpetual mechanism by Rolex. Then the Yankee pocket watch that sold so many copies in America. And then also Timex trying to kind of bridge the gap between quality and affordability. And Bulova had their own thing as well with the standardized parts. So the diamond framework as it applies to the watch industry. There's certain parts of it that carry much more weight than others, in my opinion. So let's just knock it out here. The factor conditions, one of the factor conditions listed in the case was human resources. And one of the main differences from the Swiss manufacturing to the British and everything was the mass production, right? The Swiss decided to go a different route, a route that included training and educating craftsmen on how to make their watches. And this ended up eventually leading to the biggest competitive advantage, which is their product, right? The ingenuity that goes into it, the general uniqueness of the product that no one else is replicating, and obviously the patents that come with that, like the first perpetual movement patent that was signed in 1931. So the demand conditions also don't really apply. Swiss manufacturers of handmade watches especially, they don't cater to international demands, right? The people that they're looking to sell to are pretty much just a very niche, wealthy kind of person that likes those kind of watches, right? So they're not worried about, what are the international markets thinking about our product? They only care about what are the people that want our product think about it. So related and supporting industries is pretty similar. They play little role in the whole thing because the supplier group is so tight that Rolex has one supplier, and that supplier probably won't even supply to anyone else, much less supply to a whole different industry, right? So that is one of the main advantages that a lot of Swiss manufacturers also still enjoy. The main thing here is the firm's strategy, structure, and rivalry, especially rivalry. The competitive advantage, once again, didn't come from mass production, right? It came from the product. The British had the manufacturing capabilities to outpace the Swiss manufacturing by a lot. So the Swiss got kind of worried, and what did they do? They convinced the British Parliament to pass a law essentially banning the sales of, I believe the wording was marine chronometers, very expensive marine chronometers, right? Did I write that somewhere? But anyways, that whole point was they just erected the biggest barrier to entry that there ever was, because now they're by law not allowed to sell these things, especially not in a mass production aspect. So what did that enable the Swiss to do? The Swiss had an open road now, right? They weren't worried about the British manufacturing too many watches at a cheaper rate, maybe even. So now they could focus on their design features, things like that, the pathway was cleared because they didn't have any competition to worry about anymore. So the price point of Swiss handmade watches is very important, especially for the case, because the case compares all these Swiss companies to Timex and Bulova and Citizen, I think, which is in Asia, or you could even use Seiko too. But the point here is that a Swiss-made watch does not cost the same at an entry level as, a Timex or a Casio or something like that, right? So where is the price difference coming from? Precious materials, attention to detail, and trained craftsmanship. The point here is that one does not really attract from the sales of the other because they're in such different niches. So the case describes this shift in competitive advantage, right? It goes from Switzerland to the US to Asia and back to Switzerland. I thought this was pretty misleading because it kind of insinuated that there is a shift, not only, well, the competitive advantage makes it sound like there's a shift in market share as well. So there's financial things happening as well as strategy things, which isn't the case, right? Because every company uses their own thing. The case talks about using a nation's strength. In America, it was advertising, so Timex did that. I'm pretty sure they were also one of the first companies to advertise on the radio. That might have been Bulova. But that's the whole point, right? They used their national strength to try to get their watches as far into they try to reach as far into the market as they could with their product, right? The problem with their watches was in the 50s when they came out, they were too cheap to sell them at jewelers because the Timex was like $7. And they hadn't done the movement into, convenience stores, drugstores, things like that yet. And no one in the 50s bought their watches at a drugstore. You go to a jeweler. So that was a major point of contention where their advantage eventually led to being a disadvantage in other ways. In Asia, Citizen and other brands, obviously, they use government protection. So there's legislation that prevented it imposed a 70% tariff and sales tax imposed on all imported watches. There we go. Anyways, but the whole point of this was, again, the barriers to entry were just, you can't surpass that, right? Because the Japanese companies that were already in the market, they were so consolidated already that there's only 5 or 6. And now with these 70% tariff and sales tax on all their products that they are trying to import, that's going to be incredibly tough because it's already so expensive and there's already established companies in the space. So the Japanese had this affordability and production quantity thing going, and efficiency, obviously. But this soon changed when a Swiss company called Swatch, I think it's called the Swatch Group, they came out and they basically applied the same principles that the Japanese were using, but used a Swiss-based company with a Swiss name and, Swiss colors, Swiss, not Sweden. But, so to give it more perspective, these threats that the case keeps mentioning, yes, they're threats, and yes, these other countries did experience competitive advantages, but what are they really trying to reach, right? Like the end game here is market share, in my opinion. So the last date that was mentioned in the case is 1985. So the writer of the case should have been aware of everything that led up to that date, right? So there are so many Swiss brands. Do they really compete with international markets, or are they competing closer? A good example is that Seiko is the largest player in the watch industry overall today. And they don't really... the Swiss brands, Rolex is not concerned like, oh, Seiko is doing great sales. Yeah, but their products are so inherently different, and especially from the price point, that one doesn't really take anything from the other, if that makes any sense. So I just listed a few between Rolex, Patek, Audemars, Cartier, IWC. There's so many. Hublot, all those are in Switzerland, right? So between all those companies that are there, do you really think that their competition is focused on the international market, or do you think that they might be competing with each other more so, and they're more worried about what their competition is doing in the national Swiss market and the companies that are in it? Because pretty much every single reputable watch brand is made in Switzerland for those niche purchases, right? This is not about just buying a watch that you want to tell you the time, and that's all you need it for. This is about something else, and obviously most Swiss brands do cater to that something else. So the average prices for a Timex were $7. Citizens are about $200, $300. The entry-level point for a Rolex is $5,000, right? That's the cheapest one you can buy. The entry-level point for Richard Mille is $225,000, and that's actually the cheapest model, and it's probably used like 2 years, and you still pay that much. So that's a big price disparity between those three, right? So the competitive advantage here doesn't really, the manufacturing process doesn't matter for Richard Mille. They're not making a lot of watches. But the point is, how many watches does Timex have to sell where Richard Mille can sell one used one, You know, so how like you can calculate the break even, right? How many watches at $7 would you need to sell to make $225,000 worth of profit? And then there you go. That's how many watches you actually do need to produce and get out there to people that want to buy them. I mean, eventually you're going to run out of people that want to buy you watches at that point, right? So, and another point is nobody buying a Richard Mille is really concerned with the price directly, because they know that at a later point in time they can always sell it. It holds its value incredibly. So, I mean, less so than Rolex, I suppose, but the point is that you can get a lot of money for it, and it's almost close to what you paid, even 10 years later. So Timex and Bulova, for example, or Citizens or Seiko, all those watches, they don't appreciate ever, right? There's no appreciation. Those watches, they're going to depreciate, or you just don't care about them. It was a $7 watch, you throw it out. You hit it on a door by accident, boom, and then that was it. You buy another one. But there, in the watch world, there's a whole thing with these collectors and stuff, you know, and they're willing to pay godly prices for these watches. And they realize also that watches can be used for a lot more than just telling time, you know. Because of the inherent nature of a Rolex, for example, that it holds its value if it doesn't appreciate. Certain ones do, other ones don't, or less so. You can buy it today with cash, and then if you don't know if your cash is going to be worth as much in 2 months, you can just sell it in 2 months for the same amount or more, depending on what happened, inflation, deflation with the cash during that time. So it's a good hedge against economic uncertainty, and just, you know, whether that be personal or global, doesn't really matter, because you can use it either way. If you want to hedge against, oh, the dollar might go down, I don't think I want to keep all my money or all my reserves, all my assets in cash, fiat currency, then I might as well just put it into a watch for a while, hold the Rolex for a year at 100 grand, and it'll be worth 100 grand when you get done, and that's how the market works. So the conclusion here is that the competitive advantage shifts did definitely occur. So, you know, Japan did have the production, America did have the advertising, but what actually dictates the competitive advantage and in turn market share isn't fully illustrated in Porter's model. There's a lot more other factors playing a role here, and when you compare industries by country, it kind of complicates things, because in this scenario, like, you're comparing Switzerland to the United States, but none of the companies in Switzerland are making products to cater to the same consumers as the ones in America, right? Because the ones in America are selling for $200, and the Swiss are making watches in a different range, so there's no, you know, they're not convoluted in that market. So the comparison, in my opinion, would have been a bit more realistic if, I gotta read this part, because so when it comes to satisfying their consumer, it's more important than when it comes to outmeasuring their competition. I think how companies satisfy their consumers would have been a better judgment and overall viewpoint of the case than trying to compare companies that are competing in a global watch industry, but realistically their products are so radically different in price and quality that they're not really competing. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you have a wonderful night.